Okay, why don't we get started? I don't like to wait for people that are coming in late. So we're going to do this a little differently today. It's different than what our normal trainings are. As those of you who come to them know that we usually have a PowerPoint, and I sit here and talk to you for 3 hours, and sometimes you don't talk back to me. But this morning I do want you to talk back to me, because what we're going to do, we did the art therapy training last month, and I thought she was excellent. I thought she did a great job of explaining how to interpret drawings. So, and I've been doing art therapy for a lot of years, and it's one of the easiest things to do. It doesn't require a lot of equipment. I love sand tray too, but sand tray requires dragging the sand tray. Art therapy requires paper and a pen or a pencil or crayons. So, and what I think we want to do today is we're going to look at these drawings. These drawings have all been submitted by you guys, or they're drawings that I had. Carol sent me a wonderful one the other night that she found in her art therapy folder. I saved them for reasons that will be obvious when we start to go through them, but these drawings have all been submitted by different therapists at Circle of Friends, with a little explanation about why they submitted them and what was on them and so forth. So we're not going to go through every single one of them, because there's a lot of them in here at this point. I've been collecting them for years. I'm going to go through some of the more diagnostic ones, and I want you to be able to look at the drawings and see what it is that you can get out of a single drawing. A lot of times you can get the beginning of a diagnosis. Sometimes you can get a disclosure when you didn't know it was there. We get a lot of disclosures from the drawings. Sometimes you are able to determine, by really taking the drawings and developing the techniques around the drawings, how to get you can get the whole trauma narrative out of a child just from the drawing. And we're going to talk about some specific things like the house tree person, person picking an apple off a tree. There's non-directive art therapy and there's directive art therapy. Non-directive is just saying, draw me a picture. And as silly as that sounds, you get tons of stuff out of draw me a picture. But you also can do very specific things. The house tree person, when I trained in it, which was a long time ago, was not an evidence-based technique. It is now. And we have the house tree person. Actually, this is the book for house tree person. We've got them. I think Carol's got one in her office. We have the score sheets. You can score the house tree person, and you can come up with diagnosis that way. A lot of times you can just eyeball it, and you'd be surprised what you're going to see there. So, so what I would like you all to do is feel free to talk. Hold on. What we're going to do is examine some of these and kind of take a look at what we're finding in them. I want you to be able to look at the pictures and say, this is what I see in here. This is what's going to help me in my work. And the other thing is, I would caution you, don't make assumptions about what's in the picture, because your important part of this exercise is letting them draw the picture and then have them explain it to you. It's very similar to sand tray. If you guys do sand tray, you know that you do a sand tray, and then you say, you have the client do the sand tray, and you say, tell me what's going on in this tray. What's happening here? And you don't assume that the dinosaur is a bad animal, and you don't assume that the lion is a bad animal. And you say to the client, tell me about this lion in the corner. Tell me about this dinosaur. And you let the client tell you. It's going to be the same thing with art therapy. You're going to let your client guide you. And I'm trying to, I know where most of these pictures came from, but I think this picture was drawn by a child at FUMSH. And the other thing I would tell you is that these things are timeless, because I have a couple of pictures in here from 1999 that are just as valid now as they were when these kids drew them in 1999. I do know who this young man is now that I see him. And actually he had a fair, this kid really didn't belong at FUMPS. He had a fairly happy life. He lived in Deltona. He was 13 years old, but he had really, really severe bipolar disorder. And he was being treated with lithium, which I'm not so sure is used anymore, but it was used then. He was actually really a nice kid. He didn't have to be there. But let me just tell you, this is not an abnormal drawing. This is, I asked him to draw a picture of his family. And this was his mother, this was his father, this was him, and this was his sister. And they had, I don't know if that's a cat or a dog, I'm not sure. The only thing that I notice about this picture is the sister's hands, because maybe the sister smacked him a few times. I really don't know. I know that this is a pretty, I would say, undiagnostic picture. But I use it just because some of the pictures that the kids draw, you don't want to use on a training flyer. So this is a little more benign. I can use it for that. So actually, this young man, if I, at the break, I'll see if I can fish the picture out. The first time he came in to see me, I asked him to draw a picture. And so he got the paper out, like, you know, this, and he drew, and he's drawn. And then he said, "Can I have some Scotch tape?" And I gave him Scotch tape. He said, "Can I have another piece of paper?" And he put the other piece of paper down here. And then he basically drew himself on a trampoline going up and down and up and down and up and down. And it was absolutely him, because he had the same clothing that he drew, had a little star on the shirt. The hair was the same. What you're basically going to find is that if you ask a kid to draw a picture of a person, they will draw a representation of themselves. And try it yourself. I mean, we try not to do it, but we do it. So, okay. I'm going to skip the ones that I use in the trainings all the time, because for those of you who come to my trainings, you've seen these pictures. Just briefly, for those who haven't, this 9-year-old girl was involved in a domestic violence accident. And this was a therapist's name was Margaret. This was actually a lot of years ago too. And all she said to the kid was, "Can you draw me a picture?" And she drew a picture of her mother, who was hit on the chest with a broken beer bottle. And that's you can't see it too good, but that's the blood. And this is John over here, who hit her. And this is her, the little girl, she's crying. And this is a lot of detail for a 9-year-old, actually. This is the police officer coming up. He's got the light on. He's got the strobe light. She's even got the lights up on. This kid must have seen police cars more than once, because she drew it pretty good. And this is the police officer coming over to tase him. And John was taken away. But the reason I use this one in the trauma trainings is that this is the beginning of your trauma narrative. This was the first session she had with this kid. And she was able to tell Margaret what was going on, what happened, why she had been removed, because she was very frightened, she was very traumatized, and this was the beginning of her trauma narrative. So again, you know, you look at things like the sun and the moon and the stars and all of that stuff. I always ask kids, tell me about this moon, tell me about these stars. You've got a lot of windows here. It looks like the lights are on. Tell me about that. This was a kid who actually had a fairly good relationship with her mother. And we're going to look at houses. There's a lot, if you ask a kid to draw a house, there's a lot you can see in houses. But she's got some detail. She's got a door, but she's also got a cop at the door about to come in and get John. So you might take 5 or 10 sessions to get this out of a kid, and Margaret got it in the first session. And don't let me just sit here and talk for 3 hours. If you guys want to make comments on these pictures, that's why we're here. That's what a roundtable is. A roundtable is not Barbara. A roundtable is everybody. So please help me out. And actually, this is the same kid 9 months later. She went to live with her relatives in the country. She was pretty happy by then. This is, I think she was in Osteen or Pearson. That's why we have a pig. Well, there's the pig, and I think that was the sheep. And this is the RV. And if anybody knows Pearson, that's a picture of Pearson. But she was much happier by then.
Can I just ask, what was the prompt for the second picture? Was it just draw me a picture again, or were you saying draw a picture of how?
No,
Like,
that's a good question, Christy. And one of the things we're going to talk about is how do you move from toxic play to reparative play with your pictures? This kid at this point was completely traumatized. Margaret worked with her for several months, and she kept drawing pictures. And eventually, her pictures became what we call reparative play. She was now saying, I'm happy. She liked to draw, so she didn't need to be prompted. And she would say, can I draw a picture? And then she would say, this is my life now. So that's a good question, but that's kind of a good example of when they move from a trauma picture to now begin to repair and begin to say, life is getting a little bit better again. Again, the similarities with sand tray. I know a lot of you do sand tray, and you probably can see when they begin to build reparative sand trays. And if they don't, with both art and sand tray, it's okay for you as the therapist to begin to say, what if the police came and took John away sooner? What if your mom had called the police, or who were the good people in this picture, and begin to help kids to see that they're moving into the light. It's easy. I don't know. I know Alexa does sand tray. I'm not going to say your name anymore because she's going to start talking to me. But you do sand tray, do you not?
Yes, I do it,
And
especially when I have some of the older kids like to do it because they like the sand and play with the sand. Um, but with the younger kids, they get very creative with the sand tray and they really start to show more.
right,
Sometimes than the older kids. And it's like that, they'll usually set up scenes, and a lot of times it's about them in some way, shape, or form.
yeah.
I've done dollhouse as well, and I had a kid that did a dollhouse, and it was pretty similar to the first picture of the house, and he had like cops at the door, and he was telling me about like his mom, and he missed his mom, but that was a regular thing, was the cops coming to the door. And so after a while, we did talk about what happened when the cops didn't come to the door. So it was very interesting to see how the story changed after a while.
You know, I'm sorry. Alexa was here a couple weeks ago after the hurricane. And for those of you, let me just introduce Alexa and Shanice. They are from the children's home. Alexa works up in the Madison campus, and they were badly hit by the hurricane. So they brought the kids down to the Fumsch campus. And she was going to come over and use our play therapy room. I'm sorry you didn't get a chance to do it, but all of the things that we set up in our play therapy rooms, whether it's art therapy, sand tray, doll houses, puppet theaters, kitchens, we have all of those things in all of our play therapy rooms, and there's a reason for it. It's so much easier to get the trauma narrative if you've got something to work with. Now, if you're going to work in the school, and I know Christy is, this is a perfect training for you, because you don't want to be lugging all that stuff into the school, but you can take a drawing pad, you can take crayons, you can take markers, you can take that kind of stuff. And that makes it easier for you to do your work.
Sorry, can I ask another quick question about the sand? Do you ever use kinetic sand as sort of a travel tool? Is that something that anyone has used before?
Remind me what kinetic sand is.
It's sand that it's almost like magnetic and it sticks together, but you can mold things out of it.
Yeah.
It's like a combination between sand and clay.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Look, Phil, you can use any medium you want. If you Google sand tray equipment, you're gonna find all kinds of different sand. There's colored sand, there's different sands that doesn't stick to your fingers. When we did the sand tray demonstration here a month or so ago, we used the sand from Lowe's. Sand from Lowe's is the easiest because it doesn't stick to your fingers. But you can use any medium that you want. And I know that Christy is new to us. She's coming in to use our therapy room at the Bradenton office. And I know Carol's got all kinds of stuff there for you to use. So, and let me also say, since you said you feel like an imposter, Christy, just fake it till you make it. You really can't hurt anything. You can't hurt the sand. You can't hurt the paper. You can't hurt the dollhouse. Just go with it and let the kids guide you, and they will.
I have both the kinetic sand and the loose sand. And honestly, it's the same thing with both. Like you can do similar things. For me, the kids tend to choose. Some of them don't like the texture of the kinetic sand, like sticking, and then some do because then they like to form it and make different things with it. So usually I just kind of let them choose which sandbox they want to play with, and then we go from there. But they're both very helpful.
Good, good. And
I was gonna,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was gonna add that the older kids tend to gear towards more of the kinetic sand for some reason. They don't want to have that texture works best for the older kids, I find.
That's interesting. I know you haven't been there for very long. I know that it's a real challenge being at the children's home. Shanice is fairly new, so she doesn't have blood coming out of her ears yet, but she will. That was my first job, Shanice, when I moved here in '98. Actually, this picture of this 13-year-old was the first time I met her at the children's home. And the reason that I saved this, and the reason that you're all so sick of looking at it over the years, is that this, to me, is the quintessential picture of a sexual abuse victim. And that's what she had on that day. And I didn't ask her to draw herself. My first meeting with her, she had just testified against her father in a sexual abuse trial. He had been sentenced to life without parole. And when I sat down with her and I just handed her a piece of paper and said, you want to draw me a picture? Draw me a picture of a person. It can be any person, just not a stick person. And she drew herself. She drew the outfit she had on. That was her hair. But the reason that I use this in all the sexual abuse trainings is that this picture was drawn in 1998. This picture could be drawn today in 2023. It doesn't matter. When kids have had some kind of trauma, they can put it very quickly in a picture. And for those of you who've listened to me about this picture since you came on board, what I saw, her name was Autumn. And she drew the picture, and I just went through the whole draw a person thing with her. Is this a girl or a boy? You never assume. What's her name? How old is she? Does she have a mother? Does she have a father? What type of things does she like? What type of things make her angry? What type of things make her sad? You can keep going with that exercise for your entire session if you want to, if you get something out of it. And what did she tell me? Because I written it on the piece of paper. She told me that her name was Susan, that she was 11, that she was from Leesburg, and her name was Autumn. She was 13, and she did not get into any of the sexual trauma or talking about it or anything in that session. But when she drew the picture, from the neck up, she looks like a little hooker, and from the neck down, she looks like a baby. She's got a little baby body. She has cartoon hands. She's got little baby feet. But from the neck up, she's got the Botoxy lips. She's got the really seductive face. She's got all of that stuff going on. And the reason that I use it so much for the sexual trauma trainings is that when you're working with sexual trauma victims, they have a tendency to have tremendous confusion about their identity, about whether they're a boy or a girl, about whether they caused it, about whether it was their behavior that caused the sexual trauma, or whether they were victimized. But I always have saved this because it is so quintessential. And again, that's the outfit that she had on. So, and I didn't ask her to draw herself. And I have no idea who this, I don't know, I found this picture. It was in a stack of pictures. I think this was another sexual trauma victim that Judy McGrath was seeing. And what I thought was, this looks like a 5-year-old, but the teeth are pretty aggressive. The eyes are pretty defined. And she has blacked out her entire body. And very often sexual trauma victims will black out a portion of the drawing of their body. They might black out the genitalia. They might black out below the waist. What Autumn did was essentially create a 2-year-old body below the waist because she was having a lot of trouble with that. So that's why I use these pictures in the sexual trauma trainings.
Barbara, do you recall how long she had, the older one, had been abused?
Oh, okay. For those of you who are working at the children's home, there was a time that you did not take Medicaid. And when you didn't take Medicaid, you took private clients. And the private clients were 25 times worse than your Medicaid clients. And that was 20 years ago. She had been, it was a long history. It was a long history, and it was a really violent history. And the mother tried to set the father up without going into a lot of details by essentially sticking a Barbie doll up her vagina to see if she could, and then she rubbed it on the guy's underwear. So it was a whole big mess. So without getting into more of that, it's only 9:30 in the morning. It was just a very, very messy case. I think that mother ended up killing her grandmother and went out of state. And the end of this is that Autumn recanted and the father came out of prison. To this day, I don't know what happened. It's one of those deals where you'll never know. I used to say when I did sexual trauma investigations, the only person that knows is he, she, and God. Sometimes you just don't know. So, but it was very messy. These are more sexual trauma victims, and I know I've used Olivia many times. This was not my drawing, but we were referred, Olivia, she was in a foster home, and she was referred for behavior and not for anything else. We didn't even know she'd been victimized. But Cheryl Armstrong had this client. She just asked her to draw. She said, Olivia, why don't you draw me where you're angry? So Olivia drew, she had one of those, I'm sorry, one of those cutouts, and she drew all the circles where her body where she was angry. Her mouth was angry. Her eyes looked angry, but those were her pigtails. She had those pigtails. But then she drew this at the bottom, which is a perfectly drawn penis with semen coming out. And when the therapist said, Olivia, what's that? She said, it's the thing between the man's legs that he puts in you and then the milk comes out. So we didn't even know that she had had any kind of history. We took the picture and scanned it to the hotline. It's the only time I've ever done anything like that. And they took the investigation based on the picture. I do believe, since I so seldom know what happens to these kids, that Olivia was eventually successfully adopted. I think she's probably about 10 now. But this was just serendipity. This was just draw me a picture, and Cheryl was able to figure out that she needed to shift her focus from behavioral problems to sexual trauma. And I am going to guess, this says dad kissing me down there. I think this was a very young child that drew this picture. But is there anything that might concern you about this picture? I think this was another one of Judy's. Judy had all the sexual trauma victims when she worked here.
It looks like there's no life.
Yeah, that's very well put. When kids draw pictures where they disconnect portions of their body, you want to take a look at that. Her head, I think this was a girl. Her head is floating up here. Her eyes look dead. I wasn't, because this was not mine, so I didn't have any conversation with this kid about this, but she was able to draw what I think she was trying to represent as her genitalia. But yeah, that would concern me. If I had, even if I were a 6-year-old that drew that picture, that would certainly concern me. It would concern me to have the head and the body disconnected. And to have it not look like a real person. When we do some of the art therapy trainings, we talk about, if you think about, well, Stephen will get there with his baby. When you kids start to draw pictures when they're maybe 3-4 years old, they usually just draw a head and maybe they had some legs coming out and maybe they have some arms coming out. And eventually as they get to be 4, 5, 6, they begin to put the body in. But when kids are very young, everything is in here. They don't really perceive the rest of their body. So they just draw the head and they draw arms sticking out or maybe legs. And those of you who have little kids might notice that. And eventually they begin to put a body in. So that's pretty developmentally appropriate. What concerned me about this drawing was the disconnect. And Carol's right. It looks like a person that's dead.
Yeah, I want to add that like I have a 4-year-old that I see face to face, or he was 4 when I started with him, and I would actually have like agendas in my mind of like, oh, we're gonna do play therapy, right? So when I would get to the house, he actually would come to me because we think about it, kids don't know how to write at that age. You don't know how to write yet. They don't know their alphabet yet sometimes. So, but what they can do is they can write. I mean, they could draw. Because drawing comes before they learn how to write, you know? So the kid came up to me, said to me, oh, I want to draw today, but God almost looked at me like he wanted me to help him with the drawing. So I think kids also, when they learn to trust us, not only do they want to draw, but they kind of sometimes ask for our help to do the drawing too. Because there was some parts about the drawing that he wasn't sure about how to do, and he kind of wanted me to do it for him.
What was he drawing?
He was just drawing himself as a superhero because he sees himself as very strong, and he wanted me to help him with the muscles and how to do the neck. So, but it was, and then he wanted me to draw a dinosaur after that because he loves dinosaurs. It's all he wanted to talk about when I first met him.
You know, that's pretty common too. A lot of little boys will draw themselves as superheroes, and little kids, I don't know what the fascination is with dinosaurs, but little kids like dinosaurs. It's like preteen girls like horses. I've never figured that one out either, but that's kind of interesting, Stephen, because it really does show you had a connection with him and that he wanted to do something with you. And wanted to have some
right. And that's what I was going to say, that it told me a lot about the relationship with that kid, because that told me that he trusted me a whole lot, and he had been waiting all week to draw. He could have drawn, he could have done it with his mom, but he wanted to draw with me when I got to the house.
Right. No, that's really excellent. And you know, anything like that, when a kid wants to share something with you, does tell you something. And we don't have a lot of kids that willingly come to us in the beginning. So I think that's a sign that you have a good relationship with him, and I would build on that.
Barbara, I had a question about the picture there on the one where it says unknown age. Was that a directive question to get that picture drawn? Do you know?
You know, Shanice, I'm not sure because I think I found it and I had a folder, and I
Gotcha.
think it was Judy McGrath was our sexual trauma therapist for a lot of years. She's retired now, but I have a feeling that this was one of hers, and Judy used to do a lot of draw me a picture type of deals. And I have a feeling this was one of them. But where she wrote "Dad kissing me" down there is probably what the child said to her. Not that she did it, but probably she said, Judy probably said, I'm guessing, but she probably said, "Tell me about this picture." And the child probably said, "This is Dad kissing me down there."
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, I had a 16-year-old female student that I worked with in Chicago. She was actually my first clinical client when I was in my internship. And one of the first things I did with her was to ask her to draw her family. And she drew her mother and her little sister, and then she drew herself, but she did not draw a lower body. So it was just her head, her upper body, and there was nothing. And I remember asking her in the first session, you know, why don't you have a lower body? I mean, obviously I was very new to this. Now I would see through that. But later, you know, probably 2 months into sessions, she confided that she was a rape victim. And so we got in a rape crisis counselor, but it totally, you know, it clicked then to me that picture was telling me something in that first session. So just not even having a body part, I feel like is also very telling.
Yeah, it is absolutely. When you get into the whole, the draw a person is the most diagnostic thing you can do. And if you're going to look for if they leave out body parts, or certainly if you leave out the bottom of your body, that's very diagnostic. Exaggerated hands. Sometimes kids will draw very exaggerated hands, especially if they've been victims of physical abuse. Any kind of mutilation in the picture of the genital area, whether they put a big belt over the genital area or they scratch it out dark or whatever, or they don't put it in at all, is certainly diagnostic. And which is, Christy, which is why I say don't be afraid. You can't hurt anything. You know, you may not have done that in the most eloquent way. You were brand new, but you did get, you knew it was diagnostic. You knew there was something there that you needed to worry about. You probably were more vigilant with her around trying to get to, and she did eventually tell you, which should tell you that you didn't do anything that was going to be a hanging offense because you were able to get the information and you weren't looking for it. So Christy mentioned draw a family. We do that. Another thing you can do is say, draw your family with everybody doing something. And wow, you can get some really crazy things with that. But one of the very first times I was very young. I had just gotten out of my bachelor's degree, actually. And I was working at Catholic Charities in Troy. And I was over to school. And I must have always just thought this was the easiest thing to do. So I handed the kid a piece of paper. I said, draw me a picture of your family and have everybody doing something. Well, he only drew his father. His father was in the middle of the picture on a lawnmower, and it had a big sharp blade in the front of it. And the boy drew himself way over in the corner of the picture, trying to get out of the picture. And I asked him about it, and probably not very eloquently, because I was probably 24 years old. And he eventually said that his father was molesting him, and the blade was his father trying to come after him. So we called the hotline. But here's the danger of art therapy. Sometimes you get stuff that you're not prepared for. So you got to be prepared if you get something in a picture to be able to handle whatever it is, because sometimes it smacks you in the face. Okay, this is a Hillsborough kid, kids. Let me try to remember this. This was Ellie's case, Carol. These kids were like, they were 7 and 8, and they had been placed in with an uncle. I think he was a cousin. He was a cousin and a girlfriend, and they were going to adopt these kids. Well, the cousin died. He was 38 years old. He had a heart attack, and he's out of the picture. So now we have this girlfriend who is stuck with these 2 girls and doesn't know what to do with them. And it was a very, very sad case because nobody was harmful here. The woman was a teacher. And she did what all teachers do. She tried to control their behavior. She did chore charts. She did all of this stuff. And every time Ellie would get to the house, she would tell Ellie everything that they had done wrong. That they didn't do their chore chart. They didn't make their bed. They didn't do this. They didn't do that. And the bottom line is that everybody was grieving. She was grieving for the loss of her fiance. He was only 38 when he died. The kids were grieving for the loss of their father, who had abandoned them and gone to Vermont. Their mother was incarcerated. So all they really had was this kind of rigid, unfeeling pre-adoptive mother who didn't really know she wanted them. So Ellie asked each one of them to just draw a picture. Now, I believe with the 8-year-old, she said, draw me a picture of your family. And with the 7-year-old, she said, draw me a picture. So tell me about the 7-year-old. What is she on?
Trampoline.
Yes, she's on a trampoline. Trampolines come into these pictures quite a bit. Because what is a trampoline? A trampoline is you're going up and down, you're going up and down, you're never steady, you're always going up and down. Kids draw themselves on seesaws a lot too when they're going through stuff, but she drew herself on a trampoline. And the therapist that did this case eventually left because she had such horrible cases. This poor girl, she was a young woman and she had awful cases, and it was one right after another. And eventually she just said, I can't do this anymore. And that kind of happens sometimes, but she drew herself and her sister with guardian angels, and they were jumping on a trampoline. And she identified one of the guardian angels was her GAL. And another guardian angel was the therapist. This poor thing jumping up and down with her feet up in the air is the therapist. But I don't remember their names at all. But she didn't feel at all settled because she knew that the pre-adoptive mother really was not sure if she wanted to do it. But this was the 8-year-old, and this is what she drew. And if you have enough kids, draw enough family drawings, you're going to see them. You're going to notice who they line up next to. You're going to notice where they put themselves in the picture, who they leave out of the picture. They might leave the dad out of the picture. They might leave themselves out of the picture. But what else do you notice about the way she drew this? I believe in here was the mother and the father that abandoned her. She and her sister. She's got an extra one in here. It might be the GAL, and this, I believe, was the pre-adoptive mother. But if you were going to diagnose this picture, if you were going to look at this kid and say, how do I think she feels about her adoption? How do I think she feels about where she is in this world right now? What would you think is diagnostic about this picture?
I can't really tell, but it seems like the one you pointed out as the pre-adoptive mother doesn't look as happy. I can't tell with the face though.
Well, the drawings are small. None of them look happy. But I believe she put her over here. I think I'm quite sure this was the pre-adoptive mother. But what else do you notice about them? Are they talking to each other? Are they playing with each other? Are they doing anything with each other?
They don't engage at all. It's
Right.
like they're just next to each other, but it doesn't really look relational at all.
Exactly. That's exactly what I said to Ellie when I looked at this picture. Because we were trying to figure out where we needed to go with this family. I mean, you don't do art for nothing. So what we were really trying to figure out is what do we do? Do we try to get the mother to admit she doesn't want the kids? Do we try to do some attachment exercises? But the thing that we were kind of all ignoring that we finally said this right in front of us is that these people were all grieving the loss of this guy. And we eventually got this mom into a grief group. I mean, she was very young to have lost her mate. And we got her into a grief group that really did help her to understand that she had to take care of that first. And she was really struggling to try to support these kids. And I believe the pre-adoptive dad was a cousin to these kids' father. That's how she got involved with them. So she was very angry with the parents who had abandoned the kids. She was very angry with her fiance for dying and leaving her with these kids. So she had to take care of that first. But when we looked at these pictures, I said, well, for one thing, this poor kid has no connection to anybody. She is feeling, and she's floating in space too. When you're doing drawings, do you notice ground lines? Do you look for ground lines? And if you do, what would you be looking for?
Just to see if it's kind of like settled, or if it's like they have a place where they're just settled, or if it's just floating into space.
Yes, yes, yes. These kids are floating in space, completely disconnected from each other. They're not looking at each other. They are just floating. One of the things that we do look at with the drawings is there a ground line? Ground lines are just a place, as Charmaine said, it's a place to land. And some people religiously draw them, some people don't. But the 8-year-old was completely disconnected, and this kid just felt so unsettled that her guardian angels did not include the pre-adoptive mother. So what we decided to do, and I will tell you the end of this is a happy one, that they were able to work through this. They were able to all deal with the grief on some level. And once we got there, then Ellie began to do kind of like attachment exercises with them. She had them plan meals together. She had them plan a day out together. She had them play board games together. She made the pre-adoptive mother give up the chore chart and say when they come home from school, the first thing that you do is greet them and say, what can we do that's fun today? Instead of saying you didn't make your bed, you didn't do this, you didn't do this. And eventually, it wasn't fast, but eventually it did work. The adoption was finalized. To the best of my knowledge, it ended up to be a successful adoption. But I show you these two pictures because you can just say, where do I need to go where do I need to go in treatment here? Treatment, clearly these kids are not attached to this woman. She's not attached to them. So our direction has got to be to try to determine if we're going to be able to salvage this family and if we're going to be able to then direct our treatment towards trauma and attachment exercises. So again, that's another use for your drawings. They're going to give you some information about where kids are and where families are.
The one thing I would just, if they were my clients and just kind of seeing this, that the two children 1 year apart, how they see their life at that time. You know, where the little girl, the 7-year-old drawing the trampoline, that can be fun, but those people that are on the trampoline with her are those that are bringing her some joy, because like you said, the pre-adoptive mom is not in there. And then the other one with the 8-year-old, she's more parentified, if you will, on making sure that everybody's conforming to what the new way is, and nobody's happy about it.
You're exactly right. And that is exactly what was going on. I mean, I don't think that these kids didn't feel like they had any choice. I mean, the dad would occasionally call them, you know how that goes with these dependency cases. And he would occasionally call them, he would occasionally send them letters, and she would hide the letters because she thought it would hurt them, and it hurt them more because they weren't hearing from him. So our cases can be really difficult to deal with and to try to figure out where we're going with them. So, but fortunately, this one did work. The thing that I always notice about this trampoline picture is that the only one that you can really tell is a person is her. This is the little girl. Everybody else is kind of flopping around like fish. Their legs are upside down. They're all over the place. And I think I don't even know what this is. We had a very brief support group. We've never even done groups, therapy groups, but in the early days of Circle of Friends, we had a very brief support group for children of divorce. And the reason that we didn't keep it is that they were always fighting with each other. So we didn't stop it, or we stopped it after a while. But this kid just wrote, "I need more time with my daddy," which probably made, and his heart was broken, and he needed more time with the daddy, and there's the clock, which probably meant that the mother saw it after the support group and got pissed off and said, "I'm not bringing him back." And that's one of the reasons that we didn't keep that thing going. All right, when I say you got to be prepared for what you get with some of these drawings. And again, for those of you who come to my sexual trauma trainings, I use this in sexual trauma. I can see the date in here. This was in 2001. But this little girl her father was the perpetrator. She was 5 years old, and he wasn't hurting her. I mean, he was, sometimes perpetrators in their own weird way value their victims, and he wasn't hurting her. And she didn't know that anything was wrong that he was doing with her, but I had her in one of the therapy rooms, and she drew this on a whiteboard. And because it was Valentine's Day, I think she was thinking about Valentine's. So she drew the 3 Valentines, and she drew those faces, everything, drew it very quickly. And then she drew this stuff on the bottom. And I remember saying to her, "Is this a Valentine?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "What are these things on the bottom?" And she said, "They're butterflies, and they're at the bottoms of the hearts because they're checking their privates." So what I gleaned out of this was that this was a little girl who was not feeling traumatized and didn't understand what was going on. And we had some work to do with the family that was, of course, hysterical about what had happened. This wasn't a FUMPS client. This was a Children's Advocacy Center client. When you have those kinds of Children's Advocacy Center clients, those are the ones where usually the perpetrator has now been thrown out of the house. In this case, this guy had been thrown out of the house, and there was a police investigation, and the mother had brought the child in to see me. And one of the things that I had to do with the mother was to say, number one, you're going to have to deal with the fact that she's 5 years old. She doesn't see that he did anything wrong, and she's missing him right now. So those cases can get really, really sticky. But this was just a very spontaneous drawing from a 5-year-old. And I took a picture of it because, obviously it was going to get erased off the whiteboard. So. All right. Have any of you, do any of you know how to do the wall around my heart intervention? Because we have it, if you go on our YouTube channel, under intervention. We have a playlist for interventions. And Carol, doesn't Amy did a demonstration of this on our YouTube channel. We have a lot of playlists on our YouTube channel, and one of them is therapy interventions. And this was one of our therapists who demonstrates how to do a wall around my heart. It's a very good intervention, actually. But this was an 11-year-old kid. And the way, and I'm not going to go into it a lot because you can go on and watch the intervention. It's really easy to do. It's easy to do with a piece of paper. But you basically draw one heart and say, this is you at 1 day old, and your heart hasn't been hurt yet. And then when was your heart hurt? And this boy said, when I was 19 months old. So he drew another heart with the jagged line, and he said, that's when I was hurt. And I'm not sure what happened to him, but he was now in a pre-adoptive home. The home was not attaching. He drew himself at 11 years old, and then he put that wall all around his heart. And Amy had to work with him. He then spontaneously opened the wall up to let the adoptive parents in. But go on the YouTube channel and look at it. It'll be more understandable than me trying to tell you about it. But it's a very good intervention to use. But there are steps to it. And with some interventions, if it's like the pictorial timeline or the wall around my heart or any of the ones that we demonstrated on the YouTube channel, it just helps to kind of watch them being done. And then you can take it from there. And to be honest with you, I don't know whose picture this is. It says 7-year-old girl depicting domestic violence. We don't have to look at every single one of these. When people would send them to me, I would put them into the PowerPoint, thinking, well, maybe someday I'll use them, but I just can't tell what's happening here at all. It looks like she's saying and she's saying and I'm not sure who this person is in the middle, but he looks like he has a weapon, and that looks like blood. So because I can't tell you more than that, we'll move along. You know, Alexa mentioned dollhouses before, and the only reason I have this in here, we had this dollhouse in Suite when we were over on Deltona Boulevard, and it was a real, it's not a dollhouse that you would want to have for a play therapy room, because this thing, it was a Fisher Price dollhouse. It cost $85. It could fall apart at the drop of a hat. It had a million parts to it. But somebody came in and set it up, and that's a very functioning dollhouse. But we had a little boy. He was the son of one of our administrators, and he came in. I came in one morning and I looked in the dollhouse, and he had set this whole thing up. It was right before Thanksgiving, so he had set it up. They were all sitting at the table. They were going to have turkey, I guess, and they were all sitting here. They're all lined up, and I remember saying to, I think her name was can't remember the secretary's name. I said, who's been in here? And she said, oh, Caden, her son, had been in there. Because I thought, our kids don't do this. Our kids destroy the dollhouses. Our kids depict mayhem in the dollhouses. But this is a functioning kid with a functioning dollhouse. I'll show you that picture because you probably don't see many of them because your kids probably don't build functioning dollhouses. This is what our kids did to the dollhouse. We had one therapist. She was 5 years old, and she did this every week to the dollhouse. She had been the victim of domestic violence. She had seen a murder, none of which the therapist knew. I kept coming in. I've got about 10 pictures of this. This kid destroyed the dollhouse every single week. We always had things overturned and furniture tipped over. And I kept saying, what's her background? And she said, I don't know. Well, apparently we didn't get a lot of information from the CBC when we got this kid. So we struggled along with this for a while. I think I might have another one. Yeah, there's a few of them. She always put this stuff out here. This was I think this might have been the murder scene. But I mean, you certainly would look at this and say, that's a functioning kid. And that isn't. So these are our kids. This is what we get with our dollhouses. But it was diagnostic. The reason I kept taking the pictures is that I kept saying to her, what is this kid here for? And we finally got the background. And then once we got the background, at least we were able to figure out what we had going on. But and if you look at the pictures of the homes that some of your kids come to you from, you probably will see that this is what it looks like. When we just had a removal here in Volusia County, and it was, I'm not sure, it was over in Deltona someplace, but it was in the paper, it was in the news. And the police officers and the CPIs that went in to remove the kids took pictures of the house, and the house was then condemned. But I'm sometimes astounded at the conditions that our kids live in and are removed from. And until we actually see it, we don't quite understand how bad it is. Let me just ask Alexa, because you mentioned your dollhouses, how does your dollhouse play go?
It really depends. I've found some common themes from different kids. We have like little bottles of champagne, and that's usually something that comes up. And it's always interesting to see where they put it. Sometimes they'll create a bathroom area, and sometimes they won't. Sometimes it'll kind of neat, but with random things in different places, and sometimes it's a total mess. Um, but it's always interesting to see how they set it up. We have two different ones, one that's a little more empty than another, and you have to set up the stairs where you want it. And it's always interesting to see how they build the outside too, because sometimes there'll be animals and sometimes there won't be. But it's always very interesting.
I think that anything you do with play therapy is interesting because you get so much from the kids. But the end of this dollhouse was that somebody came in, one little boy came in one day, and he just destroyed it. I came in that morning and it was in 1,000 pieces in the play therapy room. And the therapist came out and I said, what happened here? And she said, well, at least he didn't do it out of anger. And I thought, oh, well, why else would you have destroyed the dollhouse? So, and then we ended up getting one from Melissa and Doug, because I find those Melissa and Doug things are a little more minimalist and they don't break. So anything you get from the Melissa and Doug line, it usually is not going to fall apart because somebody jumps on it. But I think Charmaine has had some kids that have used the dollhouse in our area, and Derek used to. And same thing, I used to find, do we have the specialty things for the sand tray? We've got liquor bottles and handcuffs and a coffin and that kind of stuff. And I would find it and go, okay, who's been in here? Because I'd find the liquor bottles in the bedroom or whatever. So it's always kind of fun to see where they put things, but not fun, but interesting. And at least it gives you a direction about where you want to go. So
Barbara, I had a quick question about the dollhouse.
sure.
Is there an age appropriateness for the dollhouse that you guys find works best with that dollhouse?
Well, I would have to say simplistically, if they're willing to use it, I let them. If they're 20 and they want to use it, I let them. If they're 2 and they want to use it, I let them. I will tell you that about 6 years ago, I got a donation of $10,000 from a board member at the children's home, and I set that play therapy room up, which is now way back in the corner. I think you're using it for a visitation room. And it had I had $10,000. I had everything in there. I had a dollhouse. I had a flat screen TV. We had a puppet theater. We had a kitchen. We had the whole thing. And then the therapists were afraid to take the kids in there because they were afraid the kids would break things. And I said, well, if they break them, we'll replace them. It's okay. And one of the therapists, who's now retired, said, well, I've got this 9-year-old kid and I know he'll destroy the dollhouse. I don't want to take him in there. I said, just try him. So she took him in there. He was from Palatka. He was very, very poor. He had a horrible background, a sexual abuse background. Well, he got all the dolls all lined up, and he got the kitchen. He made breakfast in the kitchen. He fed all the dolls. He made breakfast for the therapist. He fed the therapist, and then he sat down and pretended to smoke a cigarette and drink a beer and say, "Okay, now I'm going to have a beer." So we knew we had some work to do with that little boy, but he didn't break anything. He just
Wow.
kind of did some very nice nurturing things, and it's probably what he was used to at his house. It was probably the way things were. So, but does that answer your question?
It does. It does. Thank you so much.
Let's move out of the mayhem here. Like I said, I got a million pictures of the dollhouse. And sometimes play therapy rooms get out of hand. And this was a bad day in our play therapy room. And this play therapy room was really tiny. It sounds like it sounds like the one you have in Madison might be a little bit bigger, but this was a tiny little play therapy room. And these kids, there were 3 little boys, and they did this within about 15 minutes. Because once it starts, it's like a tornado going up. And do you all know what the difference is between non-directive play therapy and directive play therapy? With non-directive play therapy, which is what this therapist was trying to use, you say to the child, you can use anything you want in this room as long as you don't break anything. With directive play therapy, you're going to say, okay, today we're going to play with the puppet theater. Well, this was a therapist who really believed in non-directive play therapy. And she said to these 3 little urchins, you can do anything you want in here. Well, they did. They destroyed the play therapy room. And I mean, it was everything. Everything was pulled out of drawers. The puppets were all upside down. The puzzles were all over the floor. So there's a time for directive play therapy, and there's a time for non-directive play therapy. You just have to use some common sense about it. And when this happened, I will tell you that the first thing I said to her was, don't touch anything. I want to take a picture for training purposes. And she was really mad at me because she felt like this was such a terrible mess. And it was, but we cleaned it up. And I got my pictures. I have to look at some of these sometime, see what we're doing here. Okay, this was one of our assessors who was doing CBHAs. This kid drew this picture for her, and she drew it in her notebook. She had a school notebook, and she said, I just want to draw a picture for you. And parents were both in prison. And you know, this, if you've ever done CBHA assessments, I've done them. I don't know if Carol's done them, but you only get to see the kids. You have to see the kids twice. You have to do 2 interviews with the kids. And it always seemed to me that I only had a 2-shot deal to do anything good with these kids. Because these were kids that had been removed and they've been sheltered, and that's why you were doing the CBHA. But this was Cynthia. Cynthia's one of our assessors, and she was really upset after this little girl drew these pictures, because she'd had her 2 times. She wasn't going back. She had no way to intervene with these kids at this point. But she said, what I think mom loves me, so does dad, but they aren't with me. And I was little and I was with my mom, but then it changed. I got with my mom. I can't even read that. Removed from her and went to foster care, and I was sad. And that doesn't need much interpretation, does it? She's leaving it all out there. If I was the therapist on this case, I'd rather have this than the ones that you have to work for weeks to get them to share anything with you. Because she knew exactly. She was grieving. She thought that there were times in her life that her mother had been a good mother. and she was only 7 years old. So, but I don't think we need to interpret that any more than it is. I think when I think back, the reason Cynthia was so upset was that this was such a blatant depiction of grief. And sometimes when they're drawing something or they're putting it in a sand tray or they're playing with a dollhouse, it doesn't hit you right in the face. It really does hit you right in the face when you get something like this. And then what do you do? You know, we're not miracle workers. All right, I'm going to do this one, then we're going to take a break. I think that I think this was also Ellie's. This is why Ellie ended up leaving, because she had such horrible cases, and they were all just so sad. But this was a kid who was in foster care, and you know, I know that it's a good idea for case managers to find the father off in Iowa that didn't know he had this kid and make contact with him and say, would you like to meet your son? Which is what happened with this little boy. And the dad said, I didn't know I had a son. So, you know, sadly, sometimes these guys are just excited. They find out they have a child, and he wanted to get to know his son. And they did phone calls, they did some FaceTime. And the plan was to send him to live with the father. And Ellie was at the house doing a session with this little boy when the case manager arrived and told him that he wouldn't be going to live with the dad. And again, if any of you have been case managers, it's the worst job in child welfare, bar none. I was a case manager. It's a horrible job, and they have to do a lot of awful things, and they're not always the best at it because they're not always trained. And this case manager just didn't quite know how to tell him. So she just said, you're not going to your dad. Your dad decided he doesn't want to take you. And she left Ellie with the little boy. And he drew this picture, which at first blush, you can't tell what it is, can you? It's kind of hard to tell what it is. So Ellie said, let me move this a little bit. Tell me what this picture is. And this is exactly what he said, because she wrote it down, and then I grabbed it and wrote it down so that I wouldn't forget it, because sometimes the things that our kids say are so profound that if we haven't gone through this kind of stuff ourselves, it's hard for us to fathom how difficult life is for these little children. But he said, the blue is the sky and the black is how my world is now. My heart is getting smaller and smaller. The square is me, and the holes are my breathing holes, and the yellow down here is lightning. But he was trying to tell her that his heart was just getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and that what would the significance be of the breathing holes? Do you think? Said the square is me, and the holes are my breathing holes. And there's the last heart right there.
Maybe it was a sign that he felt very lonely and isolated, like almost trapped in a box by himself.
Yeah. I find this particular picture incredibly sad. Because I don't believe this story had a good ending. And I think he had a sister that was in the foster home with him. And I think Christy's right. I think if you look at this, these are the hearts, and the hearts keep getting smaller until he ends up in a box, and all he has to breathe are breathing holes. He had grandparents from another state. Now, Carol's doing ARC reviews, so she's probably familiar with some of these sad stories, but the grandparents, I think they were from Ohio, and they had raised this little boy for a while, and they found out that he was in foster care in Florida, and they came to Florida, and they tried to get custody. And the guy was a dentist. I mean, they weren't even like poor, they were well established. They had a house, he had dental practice. And I don't know what happened. And like I said, Carol does the arcs, and maybe you can explain to them what the arcs are. But no matter what these people did, they could not get custody of these kids, and they ended up going back to Ohio. And I don't know what happened to the children after that. Do you want to explain to them what the ARC reviews are? Because I think these people went through a few, and I do not know why they couldn't get these kids.
Sure. ARC review is when there is either legal background stuff that came up that they need to check and go through and just get their side of the story, or if there are 2 or more people that want to adopt the same child. And what you're talking about, Barbara, is those that are biologically attached in some way, shape, or form. And just because you're biological doesn't mean you always end up being able to adopt the child. Sometimes it just depends on what the child's medical needs are, how long they've lived with the person that they're living with now, if they want to even adopt. So it really depends on what's the best interest of the child and what changes will be the least detrimental to them.
They're tough. Carol's been sitting in on them for a while. They're very difficult. In this case, I believe the foster mother wanted to adopt them, and the case manager was siding with the foster parents, because people take sides in these things. And the grandparents kept trying to get standing in the case. They couldn't get standing in the case. It just seemed like it was one of those things that everything went wrong that could go wrong. And the last thing I knew of them, they had just gone back to Ohio, which just seemed kind of shattering to me. But and I don't know what happened to Elijah and his sister, but I have always found this particular picture very, very sad. The work we do is very tough, and I always tell the therapists here, if you can do this work, you can do anything. If you can work with these kids, you can do anything, because this is tough stuff. It's 20 after. Let's take a break till 10:30. Let you guys grab some coffee, do what you want to do, whatever, and then we'll regroup. Is that okay with everybody?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. When we talk about post-traumatic play, everything that you do is post-traumatic play. When we talk about drawing, we talk about the sand tray, the puppet theater, the kitchen, the dollhouse, whatever, which is why the whole era of telemedicine was so difficult for our therapists working with the little kids. Now, I know that we all were able to find those the telemedicine playhouse and the puppet theater and the dollhouse and the sand tray. It was a whole different kind of intervention. It wasn't the same. We used it because we had to. We didn't have anything else to do. But whenever we are working with our kids, we are always trying to work towards from kind of toxic play to reparative play. And by that, I mean, in the beginning, like the little girl with the dollhouse, with all the upended, everything thrown all over the place, was in the toxic play stage. She repeated that and repeated that and repeated that, mostly because the therapist hadn't quite figured out what she was trying to tell her. But you as therapists have got to know when your client is moving along the continuum from toxic play to reparative play. And in terms of art therapy, you can tell by what they're drawing, or what they're telling you that they're drawing. The little girl who drew the whole scene with the John being hauled out of the house and the cops and the laser tasers and all that, eventually was able to draw happy pictures. And she was able to draw happy pictures because after 9 months of working with the therapist and being placed she was placed with relatives and being placed in a stable place, then her drawings automatically just turned into happy stuff. And she was able to talk about how she was happy. I'm going to ask Carol to show you one of hers that I thought was just wonderful for a child that had finally achieved some happiness. But that's what we're looking for. We're looking for them beginning to either build reparative sand trays or draw reparative pictures or build reparative dollhouse scenes or whatever. And we actually have a really good handout that we use that I have sent out before with the difference between toxic play and reparative play. I think it's Leanna Lowenstein's, I can't remember. But if anybody would like that, I'll be happy to send it out to you.
Yes, Barbara, can you send that to me, please?
Who was talking?
Charmaine.
Oh, yeah. Why don't I just send it out to everybody and then I won't have to remember?
Thank you.
Okay. I know it's kind of hard to see what this is, and it took me a while to figure this out. But this was a client, Theresa was one of our therapists, and she was working with a 6-year-old girl that was adopted, and the adoption hadn't solidified. They just hadn't had enough time to get to know each other, and the little girl wasn't feeling very settled, because you know that most of our adoptions are kids coming out of the child welfare system. They've already had difficult times, but this mother decided that she was going to adopt another child. So she wanted to adopt a 3rd child. So this was Sarah. Sarah was Theresa's client, and this was the little girl that the mother decided to adopt. And because this picture is a while ago, I don't remember, this might be the biological daughter, and this was the mother. But just take a look at this picture, because basically this was Sarah saying, I don't want this kid here. I haven't established my turf with this family yet, and I do not want this kid coming in. So just look at the picture for a minute. What might Sarah be trying to tell us in this picture?
Is that like a flower that's drawn on each of the girls?
Except for her. You're right. They've all got this is a little family here. The 3 that are together, this is a little family. And Stephen's right. They've all got little flowers on their dresses. They all have the same kind of stuff on. What about Sarah?
Based on her height, too, relative to the rest of them, it tells you, I think, that she feels like she deserves to be more important to the family, but she's off to the side.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good point. When you're looking at family drawings and you're trying to figure out, what am I learning from this family drawing? You're going to look at where everybody is. Where does everybody stand in the family drawing? Now, obviously, or maybe not obviously, because I do remember this family, this woman was extremely dominant. She was a single mom. She was a very strong, domineering kind of personality, which is why, even though Theresa kind of said maybe Sarah's not ready to have this little girl, she went ahead and did it anyway. And yeah, these 3 all kind of look alike, don't they? They've all got the same configurations. They've all got the same little dress. And where is Sarah?
Sarah looks like she's behind them more than with them.
Yeah, she's not exactly with them, is she?
And then all the hair around her face, and you can't see her mouth.
That's a good point. Well, I'll tell you, whenever you see something odd, obviously she doesn't have hair on her face, but whenever you see something odd, you kind of try to figure out what it is. And you might say to Sarah, tell me about this picture. Tell me about the people in this picture. And Sarah might not have said, this is me, but she did. She wrote her name on top. You see, she wrote her name. So we were clear that this was her. If she had not written her name there, you wouldn't assume it was her. You might just say to her, tell me about this person over here. What's
Yeah,
going on with
and I'm
that?
getting the impression that like she drew the other people very carefully, but herself, she wasn't careful about how she drew herself. So maybe she's worried about how the other people in that family think of her because she's not trying to make a mistake with the others.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point, because look at this little girl. She's got nice little curly hair. She's colored it in. She's got nice little pink cheeks. She's got a big smile on her face. This little girl looks kind of cute. And Sarah's a mess. And Sarah is kind of defacing herself. So I think sadly, Theresa was one of our therapists who passed away, and she didn't get to finish this client. But what she was really, her focus, as I recall, was not so much Sarah, but the mother, because she was trying to get the mother to understand where Sarah was coming from so that she could try to address some of what her needs were. And the mother also changed her first and last name at the time of adoption. For those of you who are doing adoption work, the issue of changing the names is a big thing. It's a big thing with our adoptive families. It's a big thing with our kids. And very often the decision to change the name is not made by the child. And it can cause obviously it's a problem. And Sarah made it pretty clear that she was Sarah. This is her name, and she's made very clear, because look, there's an arrow coming down saying this is Sarah. She wasn't crazy about having her name changed. And I don't know what happened to this family. It looks to me like they've got an animal down there in the corner. I can't tell what that is. Maybe a cat. But if I looked at that picture, I would just say we have some adoption work to do here. We have some, when we say with our adoptive families that the thing that kills most adoptions is unmatched expectations, that the adoptive family has this expectation, the kid has this expectation, and they don't match. And this is a perfect picture of unmatched expectations. So might our job have been to say to the mom, I want you to look at this picture. I don't think that Sarah feels like she's a part of this family. We don't know if it would have done any good, but that's where I would have gone with it. All right, for those of you who are coming to the training in October to get your certification as a trauma professional, one of the things that Eric Gentry, who does that training, talks about is different ways to do the trauma narrative. And again, this was Theresa who died about 3 years ago, but she was in this particular training. And when he got to the section about the graphic timelines, one of the things that Eric Gentry teaches is how to do a trauma narrative in art. And Theresa said, I just did one. And she went out to the car and got it and brought it in and showed it to us. She had done this, and this was a 12-year-old girl who was talking about the day she came home. She drew this whole picture of the mother was dead of a drug overdose. And she drew coming in, finding her mother here, then going out and getting the rest of the family, and the rest of the family came, and there's the mother again, and was able to explain to Theresa what had happened. But she didn't do this right away. I think she did it like in the 4th month of therapy, because up until then she hadn't been able to really explain what had happened. But that's just an exercise that if you do come to that training, he does 5 different, is it 5, Carol? I think he does 5 different ways of doing a trauma narrative, and one of them is the art trauma narrative.
Well, and I think on that last picture, the second paragraph there is extremely important too.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm curious in this picture, the fact that she labeled the armoire. That's right.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder why.
You know, if you look at these, they all have it. It's here. It's here. For some reason, I don't know, Christy, because this is a while ago and I didn't know this client. But clearly she made enough of an effort to mark the bed, the armoire here. She's got different pictures of coming in and finding the mother, and people coming in and trying to wake her up. And running in here and trying to wake her up. And I'm not sure what this thing is over here. I think it's supposed to be a door, because she's coming in and finding the mother, then she's running out and getting help. And I think it then goes down here where there are people trying to revive the mother. But it can be a really interesting way to do the trauma narrative without having to make them say it, because it is not necessary for them to say it. You just need to know what happened so you can help them. And Carol's right. This was done, like, I think she'd been seeing this kid for 4 months. And she went on to do a written timeline of the same event, and she drew all this out. I was right, maybe it tells you here. I was riding my bike up the house from school. I walked in the house through the garage to mom and dad's room. Walking in, seeing the room that my brother was startled awake by me. I see her on the floor. I'm thinking she's asleep in a dog position. I was walking around the bed, wondering where my mom was. I walked to the other side of the bed, seeing her on the ground. Her eyes are closed. Then my dad comes home, walks in the room to pick her up, and she's really cold. And then he says she's dead, and he freaks out. End. Oh, at least she put a cap on it. So, but again, it took the rest of 4 months to get this kid to this place to be able to explain what had happened. But if you do come to the CCTP training, learning how to do the different ways of doing the trauma narratives can be very helpful, because I think he also teaches us to do, I think I'll move on from this. That was something else that happened. Theresa had a premature baby, and she and I were partners in this training. And she was doing a written timeline and a drawing of the day that she had Ian, because he was born at 26 weeks. And she was drawing out for me that the ambulance took her there, and that her blood pressure was really high, and that she went into the chapel to pray. And then they took her to a room, and they told her that it was time to take the baby, and they didn't know if the baby would live, and this is the baby in the NICU. It's a really interesting way to do it if you come and kind of go through the exercise and learn how to do it. But Teresa was willing to share that with us, and so I've always saved it as part of this training. All right. These were siblings. They were from St. Augustine. It was a 5-year-old girl, and I think the boy was a little bit older. But they were, the mom had been murdered by the father. This was St. Augustine. It seemed like, Carol, and was it 2019 that you had all the murders over and Carol's entire caseload was made up of people who've been murdered. That was in Bradenton, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, and there were 5 children left behind.
Yeah, you had Carol mercifully did not leave the field, but she had some really terrible cases for a while. But we had this little girl, these 2 little kids, which turned into a whole big mess because, of course, the mother had been murdered by the father, and these were very wealthy people, and they were placed with the mother's sister, but both sides of the family were fighting for custody of the kids. And this again was a Judy McGrath case. She had had it for a year and a half. There was all kinds of inappropriate stuff that was going on. They wanted to see the children. They wanted to visit them. Both sides of the family would come with gifts for the kids. It was a typical upper income custody battle with murder thrown in. And in the meantime, these kids were just not getting better. Judy would see them week after week. They would do puppet. They did a lot of puppets in the puppet theater, and they acted out over and over and over the time they found out that their mom had been murdered. They knew everything about the murder because it was in the news, and the families didn't have really good boundaries and were going to the media and trying to have their case tried in the media. And finally, I think Judy retired, and I don't know who else we gave this case to. I don't remember, but this picture was done the last session. They had been in treatment for a year and a half. And the 5-year-old did this, but just off the top of your head, what might you look at if you were, we don't know, but if you're going to look at this picture, what would you look at and say, maybe I need to find out a little bit more about that? Start with the house. If you're going to diagnose houses have a lot of diagnostic capacity to them. Is there a door to get in? Are there windows? Is there a chimney? Is smoke coming out of the chimney? Do the windows have light coming into them? This kid's only 5. Look at the way she drew that house.
I mean, we can see the inside of the house. There's no people in it though.
Right. Yeah, it's like it's like a 3D house. You can see the inside of the house. You can see looks like a little kitchen here. Looks like a little bed up here. I'm not sure what this is. Stairs. But there's no door to get in. When I look at houses, I look to see if there's a door to get in. You got to get into a house. And sometimes our kids draw houses without doors. And because I didn't interview this little girl, there's probably some protective factor here about this tree, but I don't know what it is. Because again, I didn't interview her. And sons, never guess about the sun. You never know what they're drawing with the sun unless you ask. Because that doesn't look like a typical sun, and maybe she only had a green crayon. I don't know. That's why you don't want to really assume that this is what this is. But for a 5-year-old, she's got quite a lot of detail in here. She's got the birds. I'm not sure this was their dog, I think. I'm not sure. I believe so. But she would not tell the therapist who this was. And what did we guess? Who did we guess this was?
Her mother?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe it was the house her mother was murdered in that she never went back to. And maybe there was a dog involved, but that the dog didn't go with her to where she lives now.
You know, I'm trying to think back, Christy, because it really was, it turned into such a custody battle. But, and I don't remember the circumstances of the mother being murdered by the father. I believe it was domestic violence and infidelity and all that stuff rolled in together. But I have a book here that it's old, but I use it a lot when I look at pictures, and it will usually go through all the things that you might want to look at. And one of them is irregular representations of houses. When a client draws the house like there's no walls around it, like you can see inside, but there's no walls around it. And that's kind of what she did. She would not say that this was her mother, but I believe her brother said, that's mom. The only good thing I can say about these kids is that they wouldn't have remembered half as much as they remembered if the relatives didn't keep telling them about it. And I mean, she was 3 when this happened. And the brother, I think, was 5. And yet they knew everything about it because both sides of the family had no compunction about talking about it in front of them. So it was very hard for us to get these kids to the reparative side because they were constantly stuck in that stage where they knew, like the little girl kind of had a vague idea that she had a mother, but she was 3 when this happened, and a lot of what she knew of her mother came from her brother. So so we were pretty sure that this was the mother. And remember, what do 5-year-olds know about death? Where do 3, 4, 5-year-olds think people go when they die? Where do we think people go when they die?
That's what I was gonna say, Barbara. It looks to me like the mother is ascending into heaven, based on where she is relative to the birds. And the other thing I find interesting with the home is that it's not disheveled. It looks very neat. I mean, yes, we're getting an inside view of the home, but everything looks pretty much put in place. You've got the stairs. It appears to be a nice home, and it is put together. So not sure about the dog, but yeah, mom definitely seems to be ascending into heaven. And maybe that was a narrative that was brought to her attention from a very young child.
You know, Shanice, I think you're probably exactly right, because where Judy was trying to get these kids is to some kind of a place of peace. The mother wasn't coming back. The father was going to prison. And I believe he was eventually incarcerated. But to get them to a point of peace when everybody around them was fighting all the time, to get them to a point where they could say in their own 5 and 7-year-old way, mom is okay. But this was the last time we saw him. And it's better than some drawings that we get about murder. Let me just put it that way. It does look like there may be some peace going on there. So those cases are hard. Carol did have one that there were 5 kids. And you also had the one where the husband killed the wife and then went to the minister's house and killed the minister because he thought the wife and the minister were having an affair. And then the neighbor came in the middle of all this and he killed the neighbor. And one of the kids was in the house, wasn't he? We had
I
awful.
don't, that one wasn't mine. I can't remember who had that one, but yeah, it was horrible, and it was all over the news constantly.
Yeah. As was this one. And that made it hard for the therapist to try to get these kids to have any kind of sense that their mother was okay. They couldn't say that their father was okay because he wasn't.
Would this be considered a reparative photo or drawing if we were to see that? I mean, not having any experience of what the prior drawings were or experience with the child, but just curious, would we look at this as reparative?
I think I would.
Based-
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I would. I don't know what she drew before that, but this figure that's floating does not look unhappy. And I think there may be some protection about this tree hovering so close to the house. But I would consider it reparative. That was a terrible case. We have had some beauties, I'll tell you. I think I'm going to move past this one. I can't even see this one, so I'm going to move past this one. Somebody gave this to me, but I just couldn't get it to copy. So, all right. When I tell you that we get disclosures out of art, we do. This was one of Natalie Carrera's cases, and she had been working. There were several kids living with a grandmother and the grandmother's paramour in a trailer. I believe it was the Mexican family, and the mother was trying to get the kids back, and there were several of them. And Yazaret was, I believe, the oldest girl. But Natalie had been seeing these kids for a while. And unfortunately, it was during the pandemic, so she was seeing them on telemedicine because the house wasn't really safe for her to go to with health-wise at that point. But she said that they would line up in front of the phone, and they would all sit in front of the phone and try to talk to her while she was trying to call in. Eventually, she began to go to the grandmother's house. And she always said to me, I had a really bad feeling about that grandfather. He always seemed to be drunk or had been drinking when she got there. So Yazaret is finally placed with the mother. And this is the first session after she'd been placed with the mother that she drew this picture. And it's I can't see the top of it. I think she said, Grandpa, you should not did that at the car, but you did. She said to Natalie, Grandpa would take me out for rides to get pizza, and he wouldn't let the other kids come in the car with me. And then when he got in the car, he would molest me. I don't remember how old Yasaret was. I don't know if Carol remembers, but I don't think she was very old. I think she might have been 8 or 9. But this is Grandpa. This is the pizza. And this is Grandpa's hand molesting Yazaret. And that's how Natalie found out that the grandfather had been molesting Yazaret. And then she brought it to me, and I said, well, clearly she wanted to spell it right because she kept crossing out what she was trying to write here. You should not did that at the car. And she was very angry with her grandfather. But or step grandfather. I think what's interesting about that, and with a lot of our kids, is that sometimes they won't tell you anything until they're not in that situation anymore. And she wasn't in the situation anymore, so she was able to tell Natalie what happened. And we were able to call it in. And I think she'd been seeing that family for a long time at the point that this happened. And I believe Teresa just sent this to me the other day, and she's not here. She said, pardon?
I don't know anything about it.
She said it because I asked her what it was. She said it's an 8-year-old girl who's witness to severe DV, but sounds like the mother and the father get into a lot of domestic violence. And that after the father leaves, that the girl tries to assuage the mom by saying, I'm going to give you a hug. And Teresa asked her what the picture was, And she said, "This is me giving my mom a hug." And I don't even think that's a dependency case. When I looked at what she had, all right, this is another one of Natalie's too. And Natalie sent me these pictures. She texted me these pictures after she saw this kid because she was really disturbed about this kid. And frankly, so was I. This kid was molested at a very young age by his father, and his father bit him on the genitals. The kid was a really angry kid, and he wouldn't talk to Natalie. He would stand over in the corner when she came, but he would not talk to her. And she asked him to draw some pictures. And I'm going to show you the next one that he did. Which he drew himself. I think and I don't believe she asked him to draw she might have said, "Draw me a picture of yourself." Now, I found this extremely disturbing when she sent these to me. But if you're talking about a draw a person, we're going to talk, just draw a person, draw me a person. What would you find alarming about any of these pictures? Remember, this is a kid who's really, really traumatized by what his father did to him. And angry.
Well, he's disconnected. He doesn't look real.
Right. Yeah.
That's what I was gonna say too. It doesn't look human. And the
Mhm.
legs and feet are huge. The face looks terrible.
Yeah. Everything about this is alarming. For one thing, it's not a human figure, is it? This is not, this is a kid who probably did not have any sense of who he was as a person. And the head is disconnected. This head, I can't even tell what it is. The limbs are not human limbs. The teeth are pretty disturbing. He does, interestingly enough, have a little, what might be construed as a genital area in each of the pictures. But whenever you look at a human figure drawing that does not look like a person, that is a cause for concern. It can be extreme trauma. It can be severe mental illness. It can be severe dissociation and disconnection with who you are as a person versus what you see. It could be this little boy thinking of himself as a really disgusting alien figure. But this is his third drawing, and this one was alarming too. Because she said he drew the first two pictures that she had to really work at, and then he said, "I want to draw another one." And he drew a third picture, and it doesn't look like a human. It looks like an animal. But it's kind of got the same weird limbs, a weird shaped body that's probably an animal. It does have this right in the middle, which, oops, sorry. Maybe a disconnection here of some kind, or it may be a representation of genitalia. But these pictures, I have pictures that I've taken or I have saved that have disturbed me. These three really did disturb me.
Well, and it seems like the third picture, even though you can see, still anger and such, but from the very first two, there you can see some progress because it's more not so angry and not so disconnected. Things are joining together a little bit. So I think that's kind of says to me there's some progress.
Well, and interestingly, it's the first time that he was willing to talk to her or do anything with her. So, but, and I don't know how this one ended, but I do know when she was trying to meet with him was when she was starting to go back out into the homes after COVID, that he would not come anywhere near her, and he wouldn't talk either. And she was really concerned because it would appear that this was also the family in which the father had always also molested his sister. It was a young girl who lived in the home with the grandmother. So it was a pretty dysfunctional mess. But I think when I look at this, I just see a kid that just doesn't have any sense of identity of who he is as a person. And one of the things that you do worry about is if they don't draw a real person, because that's an identity issue that you have to be concerned about. And I think this is one of Faith's, and she sent it to me, and she said, I think he's 7. I said, what did he tell you about the picture? She just said, he said he was afraid of being killed in the dark. I don't see a whole lot. I mean, I don't see, there's no noted trauma history for this kid. I don't know where she got the kid. But I don't see a ton of stuff that really alarms me here. I see a 7-year-old who has now, remember I said when they're little, they only draw the head with the limbs. Well, he is now 7, so he doesn't have a nose, but he does have limbs. He does have legs. He does pretty much look like a person. Sometimes we overreact to missing facial features, or sometimes there's a reason for it. And this was some kind of a weapon that he had in his hand. But if I was just going to look at this and say, this is my first session with this kid, I would say he's 7. Maybe we need to look around to see what's been in his life or what he's doing, have him draw more pictures, see if anything emerges as a theme. But, and there's also, we talk about ground lines. When people don't draw ground lines really are kind of security. They're not just floating out there in space. Does anybody else have anything I mean, if you were going to look at this picture, would you run screaming into the night, or maybe think, maybe I just need to do a little bit more work with this kid?
To be honest, I would wonder if he accidentally viewed Friday the 13th.
That's always a possibility.
Walk in when parents are watching scary movies and they see one scene in their, it stays with them and then they can't sleep because of something they saw on TV.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Especially if no trauma history, it could have just been I don't know.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with that. It almost looks like Edward Scissorhands or one of those crazy things, but this was, I said, what is this? And she said, it's the shirt he had on. So a lot of times kids will draw the clothes they have on. All right, Carol, I want you to tell the story of this kid because I think this is absolutely marvelous.
Okay. This was a child that I had, and he was actually one of 14 children. His just older brother and 2 younger sisters were adopted into a home, but I had worked with them for a couple of years before they actually became adopted into a home. They had been in multiple placements, like a group home. The boys were separated to a group home. The girls were put in a foster home. Then they came back together, all together in a foster home. Then they were removed again and separated. So they had gone through a lot. They've seen a lot of domestic violence. Their mom had drank alcohol, had no driver's license, and would put the kids in the car or the truck and drive the truck and get in an accident. There was a lot of physical abuse, emotional abuse, never knowing who was going to watch them. They did see, the older one did see a person dying on a porch and was bleeding. So the younger kids were asking questions, but the mom kept sheltering them, moving them away. So there's all these secrets, all kinds of things. So I worked with the client through PTSD. He had very high anxiety, depression, adjustments to anywhere he was. He was extremely hypervigilant to any sounds or emotions that he would see in the corner of his eye, or just presence of somebody being close. there was some sexual abuse as well. So after meeting with them for a couple of years and being, then they became adopted. And we also, prior to this one, when they were in the home working through the adoption process, I did have them do the Storm Boat Lighthouse, which was a really good art therapy tool to use as well. So I would recommend using that. However, I asked him, just to, draw a picture, where is he now? How is he doing with his in his adopted home with his siblings? And I don't know, can you read that?
Yeah, I
Very
can
well.
read it. I can read it when you're
Okay,
done.
so this was what he drew. It kind of reminded me of the Three Bears, like he was the middle bear.
Okay, he wrote this, right?
Yes,
Okay. It said it, so you asked him to draw how he felt now, right?
yes.
Okay. He said, it's relaxing, it's calm, it's beautiful. This tree branch is perfect, not too high above the sparkling water and not too low in the water. You can see all the little minnows and I think it says lizards.
Yeah.
Top of the tree provides the right amount of shade. I think that's unbelievable, Carol.
Yeah, he did a remarkable job, going through lots of lying, lots of deceit, but that's what they were taught in their earlier life. And so it took a lot of time to get them to know we don't have to do that. And the adoptive parents, they were rough in the beginning because the mom kept changing the room every 2 weeks. The whole house was flipped around in different places. The kids' playroom was in a different place all the time, or the couches were changed. And so I had to get her to buy in to say, can you just leave it that way for a month? Don't change it every 2 weeks. Just try a month and see where it takes, because the kids were getting confused all the time with placement of furniture. So that was rough on them. But once they all bought into, let's slow down, everything doesn't have to be perfect. Everybody just clicked together and they're doing really well.
I love that the little minnows are protected in the water. And again, this is a ground line. It's got the water at the bottom. This is a ground line. It's got the little minnows. We've got the sun. And this, I'm assuming, is that she said that he said the tree provides the right amount of shade. That is really a kid who has moved into reparation. And we like to see that. What Carol's talking about with the adoptive mother moving the stuff around is one of the things that we talk about when we're doing adoption work, is that you've got to leave things in one spot, because these are not kids who are used to having any kind of consistency. Now, this is maybe an at-home housewife who redecorates every 2 weeks, but most adoptive parents wouldn't think about that. We don't think about the fact that for us, it's just fun to redecorate. For a kid, it's very disorienting.
Strangely enough, the mom, it was a stay-at-home dad. The mom is a pharmacist, and she is high. Everything is in control. Everything has to be perfect. Chore charts. I mean, you name it. We had to talk about no chart charts. Let's just build attachment here first. It was really crazy. I get that she needed to have all this calm, because that's how her work was, counting pills, making sure everything was perfect.
Right.
And so getting her to really change she felt like she was being attacked. So I had to do a lot of work and letting her know, I'm not attacking you. Let's just help these children, come in. But that was her way of cleaning, was moving things around. You don't clean unless you move stuff.
The stuff that you end up doing in adoption work is usually not what you think. It's usually stuff like that. It's usually, if you tell them you're going to make chocolate chip cookies on Friday afternoon, make chocolate chip cookies. Don't tell them you're too tired. But I think this is, when I looked at this, Carol sent it to me last week, actually, when I was away, and I was trying to look at it, and I thought, that is just the way he wrote it all. It's just, it's the language, everything about it is calming and safe. And everything is safe in here. The little minnows are safe. The tree is providing the right amount of shade. Everything feels good.
Mhm.
We don't, I should have put this at the end because then we would have had a happy ending here. But that's a really, really great representation. I'm glad you found that. You said you
Yeah,
found it in a folder.
Yeah, I was going through some stuff and found it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to send this to you.
Oh, I'm glad you did. Before I do this training again, I'm going to move it to the end so that we can have it end on a happy note. So,
Yeah.
because this will be a not so happy note here. This kid, you can see the date that this was done. It was done 12/16/2009. This was one of the first clients that we had at Circle of Friends after we opened our doors. And I think for those of you who've gone to one of the other trainings, I have a picture of 4 little African American boys. They were brothers, and I show it as part of the attachment. This was the oldest boy. His name was Cautious, and he had been really badly physically abused. And then the system absolutely trashed these kids. There were 4 little boys. They kept moving them around. They kept separating them. It was just a mess. But I was seeing him in therapy, and I had him do some drawings, and he was extremely closed off. Cautious was just, he wasn't having it. He just wouldn't share anything with me, but he would draw. And I asked him to draw a house. The father was very physically abusive to all the children, and he was physically abusive to his wife. And when I say that the dad was actually much smaller than the mother, he was a small man, and the woman was very large. And the way he drew them, she's small and he's big. But tell me about this house. What's the first thing you would notice about this house?
It's not complete. There's nothing. You can't get in. You can't see out.
Yeah.
There's no way to get to it.
It looks almost like a tower.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. I was gonna say there's no details of anything on this. It's just a plain building.
Yeah, they're in there. And there were 4 children, but the 4 children aren't in there. The mom and dad are in there. And they're stuck over in another side of the house, but there's no way to get in. There's no way to get out. And pretty much, I think that's the way Cautious felt, because this was a seminal case. And, sometimes cases aren't handled well. It wasn't handled well. And Circle of Friends had every single member of this family at one point. We had the 4 boys. We did mental health evaluations on the mother and the father. I did visitation with the mother and the 4 boys. And it had no good end that I could tell you, but this was just, when I saw that, I thought, this kid he's so empty. And I do this thing with kids where I say, all right, if something happened, who would be on your safety team? Who would you call if you needed help? And, most kids have somebody. Most kids have a teacher, or, maybe an aunt, or most of these kids do not rely on the police because they're afraid of the police. But Cautious had nobody. He could never tell me anybody that would come and help him. But this was the first drawing he did. And then he did a whole series of drawings. It's kind of hard to see this because he drew it with light crayon, but he had a whole series of monsters. He kept drawing me all these monsters. And and he always kept telling me that he had a secret and that he couldn't tell me the secret. So one day when I was seeing him, I said, what are we going to do with your monster? And because at that point he hadn't identified who the monster was. So he drew the bars around the monster, and he said, now see that this was 3 months later. So it took me, this was 3. It took me a while with him because he just wouldn't talk to me. And he drew the bars around the monster. And then he kind of smirked and he said, "The monster's in jail." And I said, "Yeah, the monster's in jail. A monster probably can't hurt anybody now." And then he said, "This is my dad." And I said to him, "Okay, this is your dad." And then there was something about the secret. He said, "I have a secret. I can't tell you. It's about my dad." And he finally did say, and he whispered it, "My dad said that no matter where I go and no matter how far away I get from him, he's going to kill me." Now, remember, this kid is only 9. And he was very, very frightened of his father. And I said, "What is this, Cautious?" And he said, "He's got a weapon. Even in jail, he's going to kill me." I think the next picture might be his too. Cautious did not, to the last thing I knew, did not have a good end. Cautious is probably in his 20s now. And he was at FUMPS for a very brief period, one of the many places that they put him. And it didn't work out because he was in a shelter bed that didn't belong to Seminole County. And they came and got him at 8 o'clock at night and hauled him off to someplace else. But Yo Cotel, who's the admissions director, remembered him. And she said, "The last thing I knew, he was in prison." I mean, these kids didn't have a shot. But this was one picture that I asked Cautious to draw. And all I said was, "Draw me a picture." And this picture kept going and going and going. He kept drawing and drawing and drawing and drawing. And he had already drawn a lot of vehicles. He's a boy, like cars. But this one, this is Cautious. This is me, Mom, and then the 4 brothers. And then he moved Mom back here. And I said, "What is this? Can you tell me about this picture?" And he said, "We're going to Candyland. And in Candyland, there is no rules. And in Candyland, there are no parents." But apparently Mom was going, but Dad wasn't. Their rights were eventually terminated. And she had another baby, a little girl. And that baby was removed and eventually placed with relatives. And the 2 of the twin brothers were placed with relatives. And Cautious had been in so many places at that point that I'm not surprised that things didn't end up well for him. I consider that a child welfare failure on our part. But the only thing I would say about this picture is that he worked very hard at it. I mean, there are little tiny figures in each one of these windows, and he worked very hard at coming up with a positive thought about, where can I go? I can go to Candyland. There's no rules there. There's no parents there. Nobody's going to hurt me. I find it very sad when our kids cannot come up with anybody that would be on their safety team. And a lot of them can't. So, and maybe that's our job. I mean, at least I'm in the car with them. I'm going to Candyland too, I guess. And this is the last cheerful one I'm going to show you. This again was Elijah, and he was 10. And this was just Margaret again saying, "Draw me a picture." And Mom had been smoking pot. This was Mom. And look at all the detail that this kid has. She's even got smoke coming out of her nose. She was smoking pot, and the house caught on fire. And he told Margaret that when the house caught on fire, he had to get a blue blanket. He remembered the blanket was blue. And he put the blanket over his 4 siblings, and he got them out of the house. But once he got them out of the house, the tree caught on fire and the dog got hit by a car. So I think there was hope for this kid. This is a tremendous amount of trauma in this picture, tremendous amount that he's conceptualized himself. And he was able to get the blue blanket. He got everybody out of the house. Things didn't end up well out here. And Mom is over here and she was arrested, but they all lived. He was able to save them all. If you know anything about fires, it isn't so much the fire, it's smoke. And people go down from smoke more than anything. And yet this was a 10-year-old kid that knew enough to get a blanket over his siblings and get them out of the house. He was a smart boy. I think Margaret really worked with him for a while to try to get him past the fact that he was most upset about the dog, that the dog died in the middle of all this, but he had been able to save his family. So we ended up with something positive that we could pull out of this. But I got to tell you, she didn't know anything about this. When she got the case, sometimes, we get these cases and the case manager says, kid needs counseling. And they don't tell you a whole lot. So we get the case and Margaret starts the case and says, can you draw me a picture? And if there's a trauma narrative right there, there's a trauma narrative in one picture that tells you exactly what's happened here. But it also tells you that there was some quick thinking on the part of this kid, that there was some resiliency, that he knew what he had to do, that he was able to save his family. So if we can get anything out of that's a trauma narrative, then we try to take the good from it and say, where are we going to go with this now that this has happened to this kid?
And Barbara, if I can add, when they're talking with us about things, we have to make sure that our facial expressions don't stop them from talking. And it's the same thing with our therapy, because if we have a reaction that's unsettling to them, then they stop drawing, or they'll stop, trying to let you know what they were drawing. So that's a really hard technique to get through, is just to kind of always be present, but don't have a big reaction.
Carol is so right about that. And I know that I have told some of you this story, but I had been working in the field for 30 years when I came to FUMSH. And not 30, maybe 25. But I had been doing private practice. I had been doing sexual trauma work. I had been doing all kinds of stuff in Massachusetts. I never hit the kind of kids that I hit at FUMSH. And they would be telling me these stories, and I would be sitting there trying to keep that therapist face, your therapist resting face, the one that looks kind of concerned but not overwhelmed. You got to practice that face in the mirror. But this kid is telling me that her father got his girlfriend pregnant and asked her, she was 9, to get a turkey baster and abort the pregnancy. And I said, he did what? And then I thought, okay, wait a minute, calm down, Barbara. So then every time she came in, I used to sit like this, because she told me such god-awful stories that until I got conditioned to the badness of the stuff that goes on in residential care and the level of, I had to practice it. And you can kind of fall into your resting face pretty quickly, but it is hard. And the stories are hard, and we're just human beings. I mean, we are just people. We are not miracle workers. And it's hard. The stories that these kids tell you are hard, and you want to help them, and you're trying to keep your boundaries, and you're trying to keep your resting face calm. But this is not an easy job. I'll say that, having done it since 1974, this is not an easy job. And if you can do this job, you can do anything. So what did we learn here about this? If you go back to the whatever her name was that did our art therapy in August, these are kind of the things that she told you too. Don't interpret the drawings on your own. Ask them what's going on in the drawing. And if you want to keep it in the metaphor, you're almost better. Like even with sand tray, sometimes you might say, are you in the sand tray? Or you can say, is this drawing you? But sometimes they don't want to go there. It's a lot easier for them to stay in the metaphor and to tell you the story of Susan, who lives in Leesburg, who's 11 years old, than to tell you the story of Autumn, who's 13, who just put her father in prison. So sometimes let them interpret the drawings, let you tell you what the drawing means. And we can never assume that anything is happy or sad. there's again the correlation with sand tray where we don't assume that the animals are good or bad or indifferent. We have to ask them, what do these things mean? If I had that little girl whose mother was floating up to heaven in front of me, I guess I would ask her a little bit about her house, because she's drawing her house from like she's in it, not from the outside. And maybe it's because she hasn't seen her house for a long time. I don't know, but I'd like to know before I figured it out on my own. I think we can assume that the mom was going up to heaven. I think that's a pretty clear bet, but still, I'd like her to tell me that. So your best way to start is really just to say, draw a picture, any picture. If you want to, you can say, draw me a house, a tree, and a person. Draw me a person. You can say, draw me a person picking an apple off a tree. Those are, Carol, you just talked about one that you did. The boat, the lighthouse.
Yeah, the storm, the boat, and the lighthouse. And I did that as a family project so that they could see how they're all connected and how they would help each other. And like who is the person they would turn to make sure that everybody is doing what needs to happen when the storm shows up or when the storm is over. Who's waiting for them? Who are their safe people? You know, who's their extended family? So there's a lot of pieces you can do with that exercise.
And you know, there are some really good books on Amazon. Kathy Melchiotti has written a book called Art Therapy, and that's where I got the flyer, the thing about toxic play versus reparative play. There's a lot of good things that you can find. You can look up person picking apple from a tree, or the lighthouse exercise, or the house tree person. The house tree person, like I said, we've got these books, and you can score. There's a score sheet. You can score it, but half the time you don't need to. Half the time you can kind of see what they were trying to get to. But what are you going to do with the pictures? You're going to use them to guide your therapy so that you know what are your issues and where are you going from here. So does anybody else have any comments about any of this? Was this helpful or not helpful? Because we've never done anything like this before.
I have a question about, using art as like the trauma narrative. How do you know when your client has like processed, say, one traumatic memory and sort of is ready to move into another? Like how do you sort of chronologically do it and be like, okay, they're ready to move on to something else? Because most of these kids have had complex trauma, so there's many things that they need to process. How does that work, especially if they're really responding well to drawing as their way of communicating?
Would anybody other than me like to answer that question for Christy?
I would just like to add something, Christy. I think just to think of them telling you their story is never chronological. All right, and it's not linear, because it's going to be what part is bothering them right now. And there could be something, by the time you meet them next week, they don't even want to talk about what they did last time because something else was triggered now. So we have to be very fluid in where they're at and let them bring it up. And if you want to continue to have a portion of each of your therapy sessions have some art therapy in it and do something else, you can do that. And then it shows a progression of things, and that will help put things in order so that you can understand when things happened. But they're not going to do it that way.
Yeah, I agree with Carol. Yeah, I mean, for most of these kids, it's never over. We always say trauma is not remembered, it's relived. So when they are going back into that, they're kind of reliving it. And when you talk about going on the witness stand and you didn't say that the last time, well, kids are the same way. They're going to remember it differently. They're going to talk about it differently. Like Carol said, they're going to put it in different order. It's probably not so much, did we settle this and now we're moved on to this, or how are they just doing overall in terms of being able to deal with the fact that these things happened in their lives and now we're moving to safer places. But the picture that Carol showed me, that took a long time to get there. Theresa's trauma narrative that she wrote out, as she said, didn't do it until she was 4 months into therapy before she even asked the kid to do it. When she drew her own trauma narrative about having Ian at 26 weeks, that was 4 years later. So sometimes it just takes a while. But go ahead.
And with the complex traumas, you might find that they just use color. And they're just like pushing really hard. They're making dents in the paper. They're like the anger or whatever. And as time progresses, it gets softer. It has more the ability to see shapes and to see actual people, or things just get lighter, and their story, when they tell it, it's not so as intense. You don't ever forget it. It just doesn't hang with you as long as it had in that moment. Does that make sense? It'd be like somebody crying for a loss of something, and they cried for 2 days. We don't want them to do that anymore. It's okay to cry, but what we're working towards is to make that time shorter and shorter. So maybe it's just a tear here or there when they talk about it, instead of being immobile for 2 days.
Yeah, well put. Anybody else? Shanice, how has this been for you?
Absolutely wonderful. I can relate to the having been trained just in private practice. And so now coming into this side of things where it's very different, I'm eager to fill my tool belt with things that can be supportive for this community. And I think that this was absolutely one that I could definitely use, especially because, as you said, these children aren't necessarily ready to talk or relive their trauma. And this is a way that they can have that release and get to a reparative place. And I do appreciate the being said that, okay, it's never chronological, and trauma will sometimes keep coming back up. But as Carol said, it is a timeline of how long they stay in that sad space will help us to see that we are making progress. So thank you, Barbara. This has been phenomenal. I'm excited about it. I did not go through play therapy in school. And so a lot of the information that I was able to grab today can go with me through play therapy, art therapy, sand tray, all of it. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Good. I'm glad. I have in the past invited the FUMSH therapist, but I have Alexis as my lone wolf. She comes to everything. But I'm glad that you're here. And you're free to come over here anytime. We're only 3 miles away. If you want to come over and meet people over here. I know Shanice is new. And just in terms of the trainings, our training calendar is winding down now for the year. We will do the CCTP training in October. That's a 2-day training. And at the end of that training, you can apply to get the certified clinical trauma professional certification. And it's not as hard as it used to be. You used to have to fill out all kinds of stuff. Now I think as long as you send them the $100, they send you the CCTP. So, but it's a really, really good training. We do it once a year, and then we'll be putting our training calendar together for 2024. And we always do a lot of expressive therapy trainings. We do sand tray, we do art, we do bibliotherapy. We do a lot of trainings in the different techniques, because when I ask you guys what you want, you always tell me that you want interventions. So we do a lot of that hands-on, how do you do the stuff kind of thing. But I hope you'll all take advantage of that. We work hard on our training calendar. So, but anybody else have anything to add to this? I know, Alexis, I'm glad to see you too. And don't forget to send me your license.
I emailed it over.
Okay, thank you. I got to write it down someplace because I'm always asking you for it. So. Okay, and Dina, you did ask for the art therapy. Has this been helpful to you?
Absolutely.
Okay. You know, I started collecting these pictures a long time ago because we do learn a lot from our colleagues. And I have the same thing with Sandtray. I've got a whole big presentation on Sandtray that everybody sends me when they do a Sandtray, and then they send me a little picture, and then I think Charmaine did one, and I put hers in. So when we want to look at it, we can learn from each other. So we've done a lot of that. So I will send out training certificates. Elizabeth and Carol, I think, are the only two, and Alexis, I need to worry about CEUs, and I'll probably do that tomorrow morning. And we don't have Jillian anymore, huh? Is she in daycare? Elizabeth cannot find her audio, so she's not able to talk to us.
I lost her. Here, come here, baby. Come here. She's in Monday, Wednesday, Friday. She goes to school.
Oh,
Say
there
hi.
she is. Hi, Jillian.
Hi.
Look at how
Hi.
long your hair is.
Big boogie in her nose. Awesome.
We've
Yeah.
been looking at
Keeping it
Jillian
real.
since she was a little tiny baby. When Elizabeth brought her home from the hospital, there was a picture of her and her husband sitting in the car, and the baby's in between them. And I said, "Where's the baby?" She was really little.
Got all 4 pounds of her.
All right, you guys, thank you very much for coming, and I'll get your
Barbara,
certificates out.
sorry, I had a quick question about the CEUs.
Go ahead.
Although I am not at that position yet, I will be sitting for licensure as well.
Oh,
And I
good.
do have to collect. So should I still utilize this?
Sure. We're a
Okay.
CEU provider. Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, we'll give you a training certificate, so you'll have proof that you were here. And I
Okay.
don't think you have to get them until 2 years after you get your license.
For
But-
this particular one, I think there's 3 that I have to get prior to licensure,
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well,
but might
Well-
not be this particular one, but just in case.
don't you have to do laws and rules?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Yeah, there's a few.
And domestic.
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
there's one-
domestic violence and HIV.
And HIV. HIV I've done on Reliance. I don't know if that counts, but I'll be finding out.
All right. Well, Damien, it was good to meet you too. I can kind of see you in the bottom there. All right, you guys, have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.